Thank you, Madam President. We are discussing the federal budget here in Washington on a nonstop basis. And one thing that seems very noteworthy is that instead of working to create jobs to help grow the economy out of the recession, Republicans are still trying to end Medicare as we know it, as it has been relied on for generations of Americans, to pay for tax cuts for millionaires. This is the Wall Street Journal describing the Republicans' plan to essentially end Medicare. The Republican plan to end Medicare would put insurance company officials between seniors and their doctors. You no longer have a claim to the individual benefit under their plan. You get a voucher that goes to the insurance company, and you're at the mercy of the insurance company. That would raise, first of all, they raise drug costs for seniors from day one by repealing the repair that we did to the donut hole. And then, of course, 10 years out, you're left at the mercy of private insurance companies. And the effect of that is that, on average, seniors will pay nearly $6,400 more out of pocket every year as a result of this Republican plan. Now, Rhode Island has a lot of seniors, and I don't know of a lot who have an additional $6,359 every year to spend on health care costs that would no longer be covered. It's worth noting that one of the first things that happens when you take the dollar that goes to Medicare and give it to private insurance companies instead is that the 2 or 3% administrative costs that Medicare takes out, which leaves you, let's say, 97 cents of the dollar to pay for health care, that jumps to between 15 and 25%, leaving you only 85 to 75 cents of your dollar to pay for health care, because the private system is so inefficient and eats up so much administrative cost for salaries and for quarreling with doctors and hospitals about payment and all of that. And they don't even use this to reduce the deficit in a significant way. The savings achieved by ending Medicare and raising seniors' health care costs by nearly $6,400 every year out of pocket are being used to pay for, guess what, more tax cuts for America's millionaires and billionaires. Every 33 seniors who have to pay that extra $6,400 will add up to one millionaire's $200,000 bonus tax break. The Republican budget makes average cuts of $165 billion per year in Medicare between 2022 and 2030, and that gives $131 billion in tax cuts for millionaires, billionaires, big corporations, and big oil. $165 billion out of seniors' pockets, $131 billion to millionaires, billionaires, big corporations, and big oil. We think it's time for our colleagues to get serious about creating jobs to grow our economy out of this recession, and to abandon their attempts to ram through a clearly ideological agenda against Medicare, indeed that ends Medicare, and helps the nation's very wealthiest at the expense of seniors and the middle class. Let me talk just for a minute about where we are in the tax code with our wealthiest versus seniors in the middle class. Clearly, we agree that we have to bring our finances into balance. Clearly, we have to avoid a debt limit failure that causes a default by our country for the first time in its history. Eliminating unnecessary spending should be part of the federal balancing equation. Indeed, through multiple appropriations bills this year, we've pared back billions of dollars in federal spending, and we will do more. But bipartisan consensus seems to end here when we move to the revenue side of the federal budget. Just last week, Republicans filibustered a measure that would have ended $21 billion in unnecessary tax breaks for the largest oil and gas companies in the world, companies that have been enjoying record multi-billion-dollar profits and do not need continuing support for the American taxpayer. That made the Republican message clear. In balancing the budget, closing tax loopholes, and repealing corporate subsidies is not on the table. The debt and the deficit, they tell us, are the most important problems facing the country, but evidently they're less important than protecting tax subsidies for big oil. That's what their vote proves. They'll cut education, police protection, health care, job training, and environmental protection, but won't touch tax subsidies for large corporations or for millionaires and billionaires. So there's a basic question underlying all this, and that is, are the super rich paying a fair share? Well, each year, the Internal Revenue Service publishes a report that details the taxes paid by the highest earning 400 Americans. I gave a speech a few weeks ago showing from what was then the most recent data that in 2007, these super high income earners, earning nearly $1/3 billion each in just 1 year, paid a lower tax rate than an average hospital orderly pushing her cart down the halls of a hospital in Rhode Island. I showed the Helmsley building in New York, big enough to have its own zip code, because we know from IRS information gathered by zip code that the wealthy and successful occupants of this building actually paid a 14.7% total federal tax rate. There's the building. There's the Helmsley building in New York. And the people who live there do very well. They're very successful, which is wonderful. That's the American way. They're very well compensated. That, too, is the American way. But what's different is that they actually paid a 14.7% total federal tax rate, which is lower than the average New York janitor or doorman or security guard pays. If averages hold, the very successful and well-off inhabitants of this building are paying a significantly lower tax rate to the federal government than the doorman who works for them, than the security guard who keeps an eye out for their security, than the janitors who clean up the halls. Well, the most recent IRS report is out about the top 400 from 2008. So let's take a look at that information. The top 400 incomes in America in 2008 had an average income each in that 1 year of $270 million. It's a pretty good year when you can make more than $250 million in a single year. That's really the American dream, big time. But what they actually paid in taxes, those 400, on average, was a rate of 18.2%. That's their total federal tax rate, all the taxes put in. What did they actually pay? Not what the nominal rate is, but what did they actually pay? The IRS calculated this on average. This is not an estimate. This is the IRS's calculation. So, although we spend a lot of time debating around here whether the top income tax rate for the wealthy should be 35% or 39.6%, folks, that's not what they pay. The tax code is filled with special provisions that tend to either exclusively or disproportionately benefit the wealthy. So the top 400 income earners in the country pay an average tax rate of 18.2%. So who else pays an 18.2% tax rate in this country? Well, if you're a single filer, you hit 18.2% when your salary gets to $39,350. When you're making $39,350, your federal taxes, income and withholding, payroll taxes, combine to 18.2%, just like the 400 millionaires and billionaires who made actually over $250 million in the same year that this taxpayer would have made less than $40,000. And what does that equate to in terms of jobs? Well, the Bureau of Labor Statistics for the Providence, Rhode Island labor market says that on average, a truck driver will earn about $40,200. At that income point, $40,200, that average truck driver is paying the same tax rate as the 400 biggest income earners in the country. They each earned over $250 million. They paid 18.2%. The truck driver earns $40,000. He'd be paying 18.2%, maybe a little over. And if that truck driver gets a raise, or if he or she decides they're going to work a second job at night and increase their income a little bit, guess what? They would then be paying a higher tax rate than those 400 super high-income earners. In fact, the highest income earners pay a rate far below what people who think their average income earners actually pay. And of course, tax inequality extends beyond just individuals. At a time when household budgets are strained, profitable corporations are paying just about their lowest share of federal revenues in 75 years. If you go back to 1935, you see that regular Americans and corporate America evenly split the responsibility to fund our country's obligations, to pay for America's expenses. Then in each of these following years, the ratio between what corporations pay in revenues to the government versus what individuals pay broke through these ratio levels. By 1948, individuals were paying twice as much in revenues to the federal government than corporations. By 1971, regular humans, regular Americans, were paying 3 times as much of the revenues of the United States of America as corporations were. 1981, it broke through 4 to 1. For every dollar that an American taxpayer paid to support this country, corporations just kicked in a quarter. And in 2009, it broke through 6 to 1, meaning that the average American, the ordinary taxpayer, the individual human being, puts in $6 of revenue to support this country for every $1 that corporate America contributes. So when people say how overtaxed corporate America is, it is worth looking at this record of ever-diminishing contribution by America's corporate community to our nation's revenues. And of course, the Republican filibuster of our efforts to strip big oil subsidies that would have put $21 billion back into taxpayers' pockets or reduced the debt and the deficit by $21 billion is noteworthy in this light. Even against this rapid decline in corporate tax support for American government compared to a huge run-up in what individual Americans pay, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle insist on continuing to support tax subsidies for big oil while they're making the biggest profits any corporation has ever made. Let's now look at another. We looked at the Helmsley building a minute ago. Let's look at a different building here. Let's look at the, let me take these down for a moment. Let's look at a picture that our Budget Committee Chairman, Kent Conrad, uses. This was taken in the Cayman Islands. It's a relatively nondescript building, not worthy of particular note, except that over 18,000 corporations claim this building right here as the place where they are doing business out of. 18,000 corporations, really? Do we think 18,000 corporations are doing real business out of that building? As Chairman Conrad has pointed out, the only business going on in that building is funny business, monkey business with the US tax code. This is estimated to cost us as much as $100 billion every year. And for every one of those $100 billion lost to the tax cheaters hiding down there in the Cayman Islands, honest tax-paying Americans and honest tax-paying American corporations have to pay an extra dollar or more to make up the difference. We recently voted for a continuing resolution here to fund the government for the remainder of the fiscal year, and in it I supported and my colleagues supported belt-tightening across many agencies and programs, including even cuts in the accounts that fund senators' offices. So we're not against cuts, but serious people understand that we can't just cut our way back to a balanced budget. There simply isn't enough to cut. Not since 1960, more than half a century ago, have we had a balanced budget at the revenue levels as a percent of GDP that the Republican House-passed budget proposes. Madam President, when our tax system permits billionaires to pay lower tax rates than truck drivers and allows some of the most profitable corporations in the world to pay little or no taxes at all, even if we had no budget deficits, fairness and equality would demand that we address these preposterous discrepancies. Our budget crisis, however, brings new urgency to the problem. As we continue to debate ways to close the budget gap, I hope that my Republican colleagues will revisit the potential to significantly cut the deficit by addressing tax loopholes, tax gimmicks, tax subsidies, and the daily injustice to the ordinary taxpayer when the wealthiest and highest income Americans pay tax rates that are the equivalent to an ordinary truck driver in Rhode Island. And your basic lawyer or realtor or doctor are paying rates far, far higher than the super, super rich. I see that other colleagues have come to the floor, so I will yield the floor to them and appreciate very much the attention that has been paid to these remarks.